Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get today's broadcast started. My name is Henrik Bick. I'm part of the communications team at Music Biz, and I'm happy to welcome you to Creating a Sustainable Brand. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Legacy Entertainment Ventures' Brian Penick, and it's going to feature very insightful information on how, for artists and artist managers, to create a sustainable, engaging, and monetizable brand for artists. Before we get started with the presentation, I just want to touch on a couple music biz related housekeeping notes. You might have seen earlier today that we made an announcement regarding Nylon Connect 2020, our Global Music Business Summit taking place January 16th to the 17th at the Dream Downtown in New York City. We're excited to share with you that Kevin Lyles of 300 Entertainment will be delivering a keynote interview to open our label evolution track. Very excited to have him on the program and have him share insights into kind of how 300 developed into a artist-focused label for the digital age and how record labels can advance to push forward music commerce going forward globally. Beyond that, we also made some announcements about other program additions, including an artist interview with singer-songwriter Pratik Kohad with his manager and president of Women in Music, Nicole Barcelona, giving an artist perspective on the global streaming market. And we also added today Elisa Coleman, the newly announced chairman of the Mechanical Licensing Collective in the US, along with Karen Temple, the copyright registrar for the US Copyright Office. They're going to be talking about the latest news on the Music Modernization Act and how it's influenced global conversations about music licensing going forward. For tickets, for hotel information, and more program information, go to nylonconnect.com. And so you know, between now and November 22nd, the Dream Downtown is offering a special rate for the conference of $219 a night. And you can access that through our website as well. Moving on to later in 2020, we have, of course, Music Biz 2020 coming up, our annual conference at the JW Marriott Nashville, May 11th through the 14th. We have less than a month left with our open call for presentations. So if you're interested in submitting your thought out panel ideas that'll help to inform music commerce going forward, or the music industry in general, we encourage you to go to our website, musicbiz.org. You'll find a section labeled Call for Presentations on the homepage and all the forms and guidelines that you'll need. Call for Presentations, as I said, is open for less than a month. It'll be closing Monday, December 2nd at 8 p.m. Pacific time. And finally, for our virtual events, so you know, we have another 4 or 5 webinars coming up in our fall webinar series, including presentations from Think Tank, Vistex, and Jaxta. We're very excited to welcome some new and familiar faces to the webinar series. So go to the education section of our website to register today. Now I'm going to put myself on mute and turn things over to Brian. We're really excited to have you on today. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation that Brian doesn't necessarily answer right away, please use the questions box on your GoToWebinar platform, and we'll be addressing them all at the end of the presentation. Once again, thank you, Brian, and hope you all enjoyed today's presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully everyone can see my screen and hear me clearly. Today we're going to be talking and doing a very deep dive on sustainability around what a brand is for an artist. This goes well beyond their talent into their actual personal brand. We're going to be discussing topics that also extend into legacy, which I'll explain that in greater detail, but in general, very excited to be here. The first slide here is by far the most exciting, which is the legal disclaimer. Information provided here does not constitute as any legal or financial advice and should not be taken as such. Please consult with the necessary professionals to seek advice in these areas. No liabilities accepted from the nature of this presentation or any associated parties. That includes both Music Biz, Legacy Entertainment Ventures, and any other associated companies. So that being said, very excited to jump in here. Before I even jump into the foundation, I want to give a little context on myself and why I specifically am speaking to you about these topics. So I was actually a recording and touring musician for a little over a decade. had a lot of success in my career, met a lot of amazing people, some that are lifelong friends. But I always knew that my interest was around helping others. So in 2011, I retired from touring and recording, started working with artists very specifically in early stage artist development. I did some professional management as well. Very fortunate enough to work with artists like Walk the Moon and Public, among many others. Also have worked with a number of large corporations in music, Cobalt around their AWOL launch, Live Nation, and many others. And I actually launched a few startups as well in the education and licensing space. And luckily both those were acquired. Now I'm working in venture capital. But the culmination of my now 20-year career in music is really focused around a few central elements, very specifically around entrepreneurship, sustainability, obviously why I'm speaking about this today, brand empowerment, education, and also gainful employment. And that's very specifically trying to help artists and music professionals and students actually find pathways to monetize careers, but more importantly, again, sustainable careers. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into the foundation here. So this is a lot of very important reference specifically for this topic and this presentation. The talent that we'll discuss is a skill or trait for musicians at songwriting or performing, but there is a very hard distinction, which we'll get into at the next slide, specifically around the difference between your talent and your personal brand. Again, your talent is some sort of offering, typically a physical offering that you have. Your brand is your entire personal brand. And on the next slide, you'll see very specifically that talent is actually a component of your brand. With regard to legacy entertainment ventures, which we'll get into specifically what we do here soon, we say that your brand is what you represent, and your legacy is the impact of that personal brand. So there's a clear distinction there as well. Your legacy is not just after you passed on, what some people interpret. It's really about the overall impact of your brand and utilizing, whether it's sponsorship, endorsement, or licensing. We'll get into all those, or actual investment, but it's leveraging your personal brand, which again incorporates your talent as well. Organic alignment, you'll hear me use that term a lot. It's the natural alignment between two parties, whether that's an artist and their personal brand with their fans, or that personal brand with a third-party company, which leads me directly to the next explanation, which is a company is a third party. It could be a startup, small business, corporation, whatever, that's providing a good or service. And then finally, the perspective that I'm offering here, certainly hope to not sound too robotic, but at the end of the day, this is objectively speaking and purely for business purposes. Certainly, understand and take into very serious consideration that especially an artist's talent and their brand is extremely sacred, and that the bond between the artist and their fans are also, it's extremely important. And it's not just looking at it purely from a monetary gain, purely looking at it from an objective standpoint. Absolutely subjective, consideration is given, but for the sake of this conversation and presentation, I'm going to be speaking extremely objectively. So that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into personal brand versus talent. So there is a very clear distinction that I'm going to make, drawing a line in the sand between these two. There's a lot of crossover between them, a lot of similar terminology that we'll use, but there is a very specific carve out when it comes to your talent versus your brand. So your talent is quote unquote what you're offering. Again, that's typically a skill, whether that's songwriting, performing. This extends well beyond musicians, other forms of artists, but obviously for context, we'll keep it to music. That includes your image and likeness. I saw a lot of the attendees here. There's multiple attorneys, managers, it goes well beyond just the artists themselves, which is great. But when we speak objectively here about talent and we refer to things like image and likeness, that's purely based on your talent in the context of your music. And then also that extends to the associated revenue streams. There is a distinction outside of your talent when it comes to your brand, which is what you represent. And the personality and personification of your brand is typically a good way to look at this is your music is what will draw someone in and make them interested. Your brand is what will keep someone engaged. When it comes to basic consumption from your fans, your audience, they're not just coming to your social media to see new music that you've released, to see when you're going to be touring, to see merchandise, things like that. they're very interested in especially your personality, but again, the personification of your brand itself and what it represents. So, there are absolutely opportunities when it comes to utilizing that image and likeness outside of purely your talent when it comes to your brand. We'll get into those specific distinctions. And then there's obviously non-talent revenue streams that are derived from that as well. We'll discuss that. These are a lot of, basic concepts that we're also exploring in a relatively new way when it comes specifically to artist-based venture vehicles. I'll touch on that a little bit, certainly not trying to push that service here, but there are some lines that are not necessarily blurred, but contextually being redefined with some of our conversations. And at the end of the day, it's going to provide a lot more sustainable outlets and opportunities for artists. So a great example here, I mean, there's many to name. Jay-Z is a great point of interest, comes up in a lot of conversation. When it comes to his distinction of his brand outside of his talent, his personality and his personification of his brand, again, beyond just an artist, is an entrepreneur. He's a very successful entrepreneur that has stemmed into investing as well. He has multiple different investment entities. I have revenue down here as Rock Nation, Marcy Ventures, Rockaware, things like that. But going to his image and likeness, again, outside of his talent, it's all about personal empowerment. Coming from the Marcy projects, which is why I named his venture fund that. He talks a lot about empowering people, that he's done it, providing an outlet to inspire others to do it as well. And obviously that's incorporated into his lyrics, into his talent. But again, his revenue stream, which unfortunately I don't have these figures up to date in front of me, but his talent is just a very small fraction of his overall annual revenue, and his brand outside of his talent derives significantly larger multiples than the talent itself. So very simple infographic here on the right. Your brand is, I should say your talent is a component of your brand and not vice versa. So that's one thing to remember as we go through this presentation. When it comes to sustainability, we're talking more specifically around the financial aspect of that. Sustainability when it comes to contextual relevance of an artist presenting themselves to their audience, finding those points of interest to maintain, amongst new artists coming out against, the lines of genre and albums being blurred. Those are certainly a part of this, but when I talk about sustainability and independence, it's much more from a financial perspective. So we'll lean into this now. When it comes to financial stability, you really derive your revenue from two different categories. One is active income, another is passive income. As you see here on the active income, which we'll go through all these, this very specifically pertains to album cycles. When artists are active, and this doesn't have to be a specific, album collection, an LP of music. It can be a standalone single. It's more around a promotional campaign is a better way to generalize this. But when it comes to active income derived specifically from your talent, it's typically a service base that requires an action. So when you look at releasing music, and this encompasses everything from the concept to the actual, application of writing music, recording it, and then promoting it, those are all service-based, areas where you physically have to, either perform or provide a service, and it does require an action. Releasing that music, obviously, there's timelines that are extended around promotional campaigns, album cycles. We're traditionally, 1.5 to 2 years, depending on the success of the album on average. So, if you look at what's known as the bell curve, that would be the peak of the bell curve when you are very prominent in the visible spectrum, when you have a lot of promotional and marketing efforts around your music. That typically would include a tour, that typically includes merchandise, or something that is a consumer good that's being sold. And for sake of conversation, that's also very actively when synchronization is happening from a licensing standpoint for your music. There are obviously artists, possibly even some on this webinar that have had back catalogs placed as far as syncs go, and that's great. But I'm talking more contextually about, you have new music that's being released, you have music that's being pushed, you have music that's gaining traction within that specific album cycle. So when it comes to active income, again, the main things to take away are that it relies predominantly on your talent, and it does require some sort of specific service. Passive income is something that unfortunately is not discussed enough when it comes to music. And obviously everything on the left column applies to the right. Your music is going to generate some form of revenue over time. When you're not on an album cycle, when you're at the bottom side of the bell curve. And also, you're going to play sporadic shows, your merchandise will sell, hopefully back catalog placement will happen, even for recent album cycles. But what I'm talking about is more specifically things that, do not rely so much on your talent, but more so rely on the brand. So this is thought of, contextually outside of music, but absolutely, it holds its own in music as well, as something that is paid potentially on a recurring basis, or automated, especially when you get into to utilizing technology. If you're familiar with what's known as a SaaS platform, which is software as a service, it's taking a service and automating that process, so there's not a physical human doing it. That does apply here. I'll get into a specific example of that further on. But again, it's not requiring you to be very physically active for that actual revenue stream. It's looking much more to reoccurring or passive, but again, non-action oriented. The other main component here is that it relies on your personal brand. There's obviously crossover from your talent again to the passive side, but contextually speaking, we're referencing more specifically the brand. Very common scenarios here are sponsorships, brand licensing, and endorsement. A sponsorship is where you're actually aligning with a good or a service and promoting that to a certain extent. There is a distinction between a sponsorship and an actual endorsement. But in the scenario of a sponsorship, we're seeing sponsorships happen around, especially social media, which the FTC ruled several years ago that now you have to actually put the hashtag of an advertisement to disclose when a sponsorship or an endorsement is happening. There's many more scenarios beyond that. We'll get into all of that. When it comes to licensing your brand, your likeness, there's a lot of scenarios. On the venture side, the partner for Legacy Entertainment Ventures is Loud Capital. It's heavily investing in CBD. When I talk to talent or their teams, when it comes to investment scenarios, which is again what we do at Legacy Entertainment, CBD comes up in every single conversation. While there are absolutely great opportunities for third-party companies that are looking to align with talent to essentially just put their face on a product and then pay them either on a single or reoccurring basis, there's also the opportunity for those artists to actually invest in, say, the supply chain, which we'll get into that in a second. So when it comes to sponsorship, brand licensing, or endorsement scenarios, those are most common. When it comes to passive, those typically include a third-party company that could be handling the marketability. It could be outsourced to a secondary third party. It could be handled by your team. And the last category here, which is I've touched on very briefly, is investing. It's actually looking at the scenario of, okay, I have an established brand. There's obviously a value to that brand. How can we monetize that brand, not only from a one-to-one scenario, say through a sponsorship, licensing, or endorsement scenario where you're being paid out from a third-party company to put your face on something for maybe an appearance or some sort of association, or being even paid when your fans engage with that product, again on like an affiliate side. But the investment scenario is really interesting because it allows you to move beyond that one-to-one relationship of actually seeing a return when your fans engage with across, again, sponsorship, licensing, or endorsement scenarios, to where you're investing at the root of the solution. So at that point, it becomes a one-to-many scenario. And there's a lot of restrictions around investing. There's certain individual high net worth that you have to be approved when it comes to the SEC. But at the end of the day, investing is absolutely a great solution. It's certainly something that everyone could and should consider if they are able to objectively meet that point. But you see that value of one-to-many, to where it's not just you're seeing some sort of a windfall passively for income when your fans engage with a product or service. It's more the mentality of when any fan or any celebrity engages with a product or service that you've invested in, and you're actually seeing a return from that. I did pen an article recently in Billboard, and I do elaborate that towards the bottom around celebrity investment scenarios. That article's called 5 Music Tech Investment Areas You Need to Know. But all of this being said, there are some inherent problems when it comes to really the perspective of artists and around sustainability. Again, leaning into those active income scenarios, considering changes in the market, industry trends, competitive landscape. These are major factors, but at the end of the day, you can't tour forever. You can't tour 12 months out of the year. I mean, there are physical limitations, mental and emotional as well. You can't constantly be releasing music. So again, traditionally when I worked with artists, I saw the very active perspective was the only one that was taken. And also when it comes to general entrepreneurship, you have personalities that are influencers. Gary Vee is a very popular one. They talk a lot about passive income streams, but unfortunately that hasn't really trickled into the music industry. These are absolutely areas to consider. The other thing that's not really talked about when it comes to really career planning, wealth management, things like that. It's amazing coming from bands that toured extensively, from my own projects, seeing people that were getting to a certain age when they wanted to start planning for a family, or retirement was something that rarely came up, even, when my bands were doing well, or, especially my clients were doing well when I was working on the servicing side. These are long-term areas that really need to be considered, and again, quite frankly, are not discussed enough. Again, you can hit peaks in your career. The average age of someone on the top of the Billboard charts as of 2018 was 28 years old. The average age of an athlete was 26-year-old. That was at the peak of their career. Esports gamer was 25. So there is a lot to be said when it comes to long-term career and wealth management planning that, again, just needs to be discussed more in general. So sustainability obviously plays into that, but we'll go ahead and move beyond this. So when it comes to looking at these scenarios from active to passive income scenarios, before you can make any connections with a third-party company to start to tap into, again, sponsorship, endorsement, licensing, or investment scenarios, you really have to understand both your personal brand, but also your audience. It's extremely important to consider, again, speaking very objectively, that your audience is made up of a base of consumers. They are, again, brought in typically by your talent, but they have more consumption habits beyond just music. These, everybody has to eat, everyone has to drink, everyone has to have, clothing, shelter, basic necessities. But when it comes to, knowing your audience and those commonalities, one of the most important questions to ask yourself is, how well do you know your audience? In addition to that, the next natural question is, how does your brand align with your actual audience? So some very similar characteristics that you can start to compare, and we'll go through basic to advanced and then some extremely detailed. I've worked with a lot of high-end artists to break down these categories. I've worked with companies to look at this. This term is also known as basic lead intelligence, but contextually speaking, this is much more around your audience. So basic characteristics are around age, location, to some gender and ethnicity are important. Just to get some sort of makeup and understanding. And that's great if you at least have that context, that's important. Jumping into what's much more advanced, again, something that a lot of artists are seeking, or like social media preference when it comes to what networks, engagement frequency. You probably have some basic understanding with your artists, with your fans rather, about what social media platform works best, what times are of the optimal to post or engage with your audience. Also looking at similar artists that play in the space, not necessarily just from a talent side, but also from especially a brand presence side when it comes to social media. I have, with our education platform, Musicians Desk Reference, we have a component there that's called a case study, which leans very heavily into research, typically around when you're looking for a manager, booking agent, things like that. And it's really a qualifying mechanism and process, so that when you do engage with those third-party professionals, you have some historical context on who they are, what types of clients they work with, what their preferences are when it comes to identifying and securing new talent. But one of the most overlooked yet most important is a case study when it comes to personal brand and social media. So there's an extended template in there, and this is something you don't necessarily need our template for, but just really considering similar artists in your field, again, not only from a talent perspective, but how do they engage with their fans? What networks are they using? What's the engagement frequency? What tactics are they using? And getting a sense of that and staying current with it as well, because there's always going to be new talent and there's always going to be improvements to existing talent. And then these next characteristics jump in from the work that I've done with, again, both artists and corporations, but it's extremely important to have context here, especially when you are looking at the alignment of potential sponsorship, licensing, endorsement, or investment scenarios. So basic consumption habits. Certain fans, have specific brand loyalty. Brand loyalty is something that's very interesting because it's absolutely a tactic that's utilized from successful brands. But identifying loyalty, I mean, I'm sitting here right now, I have an Apple phone, I have an Apple mouse, an Apple laptop, I have Apple accessories that I'm using. I'm loyal to Apple, not necessarily saying it's the best brand, but it's just something that I personally have become very familiar with. So there have been studies shown, and we've done some work in this space as well, that even when it comes to stock photography, when you're advertising something, having some idea of the segmentation and persona of your audience. If you're promoting to a predominantly Apple-based crowd and you're using PC products, there's some sort of separation, and that also extends into anti-brands. That can be just based on preference, that can be on ethics, that can be on religion, that can be on a lot of different areas. But knowing what brands from a consumption standpoint your fans are loyal to, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, what brands they do not want to align with. Having an artist that is a part of the LGBTQ plus community, that artist, if they're seen taking a picture, eating Chick-fil-A, that's probably not going to be a scenario where their fan base is very interested and engaging, especially if it's contextually a sponsored or a post or an endorsement of a product or service. Again, speaking very objectively, I know that's a hot topic for discussion. But buying ethics, are a very real thing. It's amazing, looking at so many studies, which I technically do fall into the millennial generation. I'm one of the eldest millennials, but millennials and Gen Z especially are two of the most ethical generations out. They provide much more conscious decision application when it comes to consumption. When it comes to like social impact and giving, they're absolutely two of the most generous generations out there. So those ethics absolutely do play in. So looking internally, self-reflecting, and also seeing what aligns with your audience. Education is something that plays largely into when it comes to marketing, promotional campaigns, but also looking at the actual content itself. It's not so much that one of these categories is better than the other. It's just having an understanding of your audience. Do these individuals have some sort of GED or high school equivalency, or do they focus on trade schools? Do they have a high school education, college, graduate, doctoral? Any of those things. Having that context, especially when you get specifically to markets. Even something is simple as when you're playing. If you are an artist and your brand is promoting instrumentation or really leaning into the talent side. I worked with an amazing artist that pushed sitar combined with electronic music, and he went to Berkeley. He was the first one to actually major in sitar performance at Berkeley. So every time the band played in Boston, there would be a massive gathering of people who were interested very specifically into the sitar. So while it was absolutely a part of his talent, we leaned into that on his brand because they were one of the most unique, presentations of using a sitar. But again, he was the only person to major in that at Berkeley while he was there. Employment is another very interesting, aspect here. The hourly salary, looking at, disposable income, it's always, important to remember that with fans. So if you are, a DIY artist and for some reason you decide to push a luxury brand, that might not necessarily match with your demographic. Not saying anything negative about your demographic, but at the end of the day, again, making sure there's very organic alignment. Something that's really, really significant that I found over the years is actually looking at the schedule of employment. Are your fans typically more corporate, or are they 9 to 5, or are they more service industry, 6 to 3, things like that. So it's really important to have that context. This can apply to their availability to come to shows. If you look at like the seasonal or annual employment, if a lot of your fan base seems to work things like retail and they're very seasonal, that might not be the most optimal time for you to tour. But also when it comes to these sustainable brand components for sponsorship, endorsement, or licensing scenarios, you might want to shy away from that because obviously those individuals are inundated what influences their decisions? Is it family? Is it politics, religion, environment, their actual employer, that gives them the freedom to, consume independently, or at least to be vocal about it. And then just to wrap this up, distractions are always a very important part here. Sports, holidays, looking at the correlation of, say, like a country music artist. I have some friends that tour some very large packages. Those tours typically don't happen around, massive events when it comes to like the Super Bowl or the World Series or things like that. A lot of those tours are done off holiday season or off sports season, and pop up at other times. So just having all of this audience intelligence is only going to provide you more value when it comes to the sustainable, brand perspective, but also just really, having more understanding of who your consumers are. And the summary here, just to take all that, text and put it into something visual, the organic alignment that you're looking for is between your brand, your audience, and your influence. So there's a lot of crossover at the top here between your brand and your audience. When it comes to utilizing your influence, it's absolutely a part of it as well. But looking specifically at that, inner cross section is extremely important, and having this contextually to inform the decision once you have the intel from your audience, when it comes to especially the third parties that you're aligning with, and also how your influence will translate when it comes to engagement with those third-party products and services, is extremely important. So this is something that you want to really focus on. Another thing that is important to consider here, a lot of these areas that are being discussed, some of you might be asking, well, this is something that only someone, I mentioned Jay-Z, so the ultra high net worth individuals or the 1% can utilize, and that's absolutely not true. You may be familiar with the term micro influencer, and it's typically looking at somebody who has a social media following of, some people categorize it between 10 and 250,000 based on the individual platform. But this is not the 1%. This isn't even the entire remaining 99%. To a certain extent, this is, what would be considered the base, or the introductory 1%, the base of the pyramid, if you will. So when it comes to micro influencers, there's a few very important components to remember here in general. It's extremely cost effective for a third party to engage with a micro influencer. Everyone's, vying for the Taylor Swifts, the Kylie Jenners, Beyonce's, whomever. But those individuals have an actual standard when it comes to historical context on what they're charging for to align their brand. And working in an unstandardized area of this industry is actually a big positive, because you really get to set more of your own terms in the price. You have a lot more flexibility, which we'll get into as well. But in general, this also scales down to the hyper-localization, which we'll get into in a second. But when we look at the benefit of smaller artists, and this also applies to a local and a regional level of engaging with a third party across any of those sponsorship, endorsement, or licensing scenarios. From a company perspective, it's less per transaction per influencer, so that's a huge value add. When it comes to micro influencers as well, and engagement is typically much higher than visibility. Engagement is specifically somebody interacting with some sort of relationship between a personal brand and a third-party company. These are scenarios where the visibility is not as high as, again, that top 1%, but the engagement derived even from a local band on marketing campaigns is substantially higher than that when it comes to those of national campaigns. Those typically, and historically have targeted the visibility and hoping that the artist will, push as hard as they can, or that the nature of the interest from the audience to the artist will translate to the third-party company. But that's not really true, and we're in this huge paradigm shift, over the past, especially 5 years, to where, sponsored content has, worked in some regard, not necessarily worked in other regard. But now these companies need engagement. They need to prove that the sponsorship, the advertising dollars, the influencer marketing is working. So it leans much more to the engagement. And what a lot of these companies are seeing is that actually aligning with earlier artists that have more dedicated fans are producing a lot higher engagement rates. There's a very specific report that came out from the the Kelly Face survey that specifically states, and I use this in my Billboard article as well, that 82% of consumers engaged were more interested when it comes to micro influencers than that of macro influencers, and 82% is against that of 73% of the peer-to-peer. So what that means is if a friend is just referring another friend to a product or service, that's typically seeing about 73% engagement within very closed garden engagement scenarios. But if somebody has some sort of influence, yet they're not the top 1%, that yields a higher response from consumer engagement. And that's extremely important. They didn't have a lot of context around macro influencers, but if you can see a few solid percent in general, that's actually good, but obviously the visibility is much higher. And the other thing to talk about here is the scalability and flexibility. Multiple campaign variations, having maybe one brand that's trying to launch in 50 different states and 5 markets in each state. They can elect to work with individuals in those communities and markets that have a much higher natural engagement rate, because that's where they're based and that's where their initial and core demographic fans are. So they can get into variant testing, demographic testing, segmentation, things like that. For states 1 through 10, it can be a different campaigns through states 11 through 20. They can work with different artists. So at the end of the day, the scalability and flexibility from both the company perspective is important, but also from the artist, because you also get to typically have more of a say from a micro influencer standpoint on how these campaigns are governed. So it's not necessarily a macro campaign to where someone, a company steps in and says, I want an artist. It can be artist ABC, XYZ, it doesn't matter. I just want someone to fulfill this predetermined marketing role. But you're looking for something where you can actually have some creative input, because from a talent and brand perspective, if you can have some influence on the campaign, your fans better than this third-party company does. So it's extremely important. And again, in general, musicians are an untapped micro influencer market. So to summarize this, content creators plus the hyper-localization is the benefit for an unstandardized market. So I do encourage you to go look up that Kelly Face survey summary. There's a lot of great information in here. When it comes to the opportunity, and we're going to get from here into specific examples, because a lot of this is very generalized, we're getting more into the specifics and the practical application now. So when it comes to the brand fan alignment and those consumption commercialization areas, that's where you lead into engagement. So and there is a bit of a checklist here at the end. So you've identified what your personal brand is, you've identified who your fans are, and actually been able to gauge where those alignments are. You're starting to creatively come up with these natural points of consumption and commercialization that are derived from that. So now you actually want to engage with a third-party company. So when it comes to the spectrum of the corporations versus startups and small businesses, there are some very common characteristics between those two segments. Looking that corporations typically want a larger brand, or someone with a larger presence when it comes to their talent. When it comes to a fixed campaign, that's what I was mentioning a moment ago, those are typically the insert artist XYZ or ABC here. The campaign necessarily won't charge. And while that absolutely works for some sponsorship, licensing, or endorsement scenarios, you want to try to find scenarios from a micro influencer standpoint where you actually can influence and have some say in the marketability, because again, that organic alignment, not necessarily just between you and your brand and your audience, but now incorporating a third-party company here is extremally important. These are traditionally short-term campaigns. It could be anywhere from a day to a month to a year, but whatever the case may be, there's typically some sort of basis as far as a predetermined time period that's set. Obviously, campaigns can be renewed for any reason, but at the end of the day, these are typically fixed, and certain periods of time are determined upfront. The return on the investment from the company side typically falls at the benefit of the company over the talent or the brand. When you are looking at a scenario, I've had artists that were paid, to stand in front of a billboard or to market a product along a tour, and those were great scenarios, and at the time the payouts were amazing, especially given the size of that talent. But what was interesting is considering that the objective exploitation of that talent, and specifically their brand, always lended a greater return to the company. So regardless of what check size the company would cut, or if it's reoccurring payments, typically the company is the one seeing the benefit. Otherwise, they would not be paying for the talent and brand association. So it's something just to keep in mind, that whenever you might see a quick payday, there's somebody else out there that's again, objectively, not necessarily in a negative way, exploiting your brand for their own gain, and that gain is more substantial than what you're seeing directly. What's very interesting is if you take this and scale it over to startups or small businesses, especially on a hyper-localized level or even regionalized, they're much more willing to work with those micro influencers. You're looking at smaller brands' talent. This can be a local company with a single good or service offering that has a single location that's looking to target one artist in their market just to help scale out. And we'll get into a very specific reference which discusses this. But even on the advertising side, one of the companies I had, SoundStir, before it was acquired, we were really trying to solve a problem around music licensing and helping artists get paid when their music is used, especially in a live setting. But in addition to that, we also had an advertising component. We were building an advertising network that really didn't have any limitations for anyone coming in to advertise. And I'll never forget, we had a tire company in our hometown of Cincinnati that called us and really wanted to sponsor a hard rock show. And they basically said nobody would take their money, and they literally just wanted to be a part of the show because they knew that was their fan base and their target demographic. So being able to lean into those more micro influencer, smaller, local, regionalized talent, the startups and small businesses, especially from a local perspective, are absolutely at least willing and more likely to have those conversations, whether or not something manifests is up to a case-by-case scenario. The flexibility around the campaigns is extremely important as well, because it's not a one-size-fits-all that's being brought to the table. You typically have, companies that might have some sort of marketing assistance. They might be working with a brand or an agency, and they're looking to actually, align with talent, but they're also open to the perspective of the talent because they realize that, you actually do know your audience, and the cement might be poor, but not necessarily dry when it comes to the, marketability and the parameters of the campaign. So the flexibility of campaigns is something that's very important. Again, utilizing your brand, your audience, getting in, having some sort of a say. That becomes especially, relevant when somebody's actually getting into the equity positions and investing in things like that. But the third party approaches you, and they're open to have a conversation about how to better determine how that campaign will fit your audience. Absolutely be open and willing to that conversation. These are also, they can scale into much more mid and long-term campaigns. The longer term you associate your personal brand with a product or service, the more engagement you're going to see from your audience. The campaigns that are just, being thrown up on social media for a single post and third-party companies are paying for it, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I'm saying that they typically lean more on the visibility, and these companies, these third-party companies, are not seeing as high ROI, return on investment, as they would like. So the long-term brand association, integrated marketing to where you might not even know it's necessarily advertising a product, which we'll get into that in a second, is extremely important. So at this point, the return on the investment could benefit the company, but it also could be equally as beneficial to the talent. There's actually some scenarios where the talent can see more of a benefit from the company, typically leans more into long-term association. If you can negotiate like equity-based positions or actually invest, those are absolutely scenarios to look at. But the spectrum of compensation structures, when you fall one side of the spectrum to the minimal return or the short term, that traditionally falls to a single payout or a flat fee, could lean into a reoccurring fee, which could be more over time. And then there is this dividing line in the sand to where you can start to get into, like equity-based positions, things like that. Obviously, consult your entertainment attorney and your business manager and your personal manager and anyone working, within your team. But being able to negotiate equity is a very, very good position. And then at a certain point, looking at scenarios where you can actually either negotiate majority equity of the deal, or you can negotiate to invest in a company and help scale that company up by leveraging your personal brand and associating that is absolutely where you're going to see the largest payout. A lot of artists here, I wish I could see all of you and get a view of hands. So many artists are utilizing TikTok right now. And when you utilize TikTok, again, it's that one-to-one scenario. It's you engaging with your fans. It's adding value to that relationship, but it is still just between you and your fans. Imagine if you could have invested in the parent company of TikTok several years ago, and then the last 2-3 years worth of album campaigns were exclusively done through TikTok. At that point, you're seeing a much, much larger return, but it's not necessarily just when your fans engage with a platform or service. that you have invested in. It's also now every single scenario of where any other artist that maybe you've influenced or just by proxy have found their way onto the platform. You're seeing a return potentially when they is a personal brand or talent engage with that product or service that you potentially have invested in, but also when they're fans. So you're seeing a windfall come through the pipeline as far as passive income from somebody who you have no direct association with. So it's really just about having the context of that perspective. Again, there are a lot of restrictions around investment, but when it comes to those conversations about those campaign structures financially, maybe there are certain relevant areas where you can start to discuss things like equity, even if it's a very minimal piece or a pathway to equity. It's really just about having that perspective is invaluable. So getting into the engagement examples as we start to wrap this here, just given time, the column on the left is very broad. So I'm not going to spend as much time here because it's really about the creative context in which it's applied. So general examples, advertising, sponsors, shows and tours, you can do social media, sponsored content. I'm just kind of, freely going off of this list, appearances, in-store branded content, product collabs, giveaways, prizes, meet and greets, product reviews, reveals, launches, integrated marketing campaigns. You've probably seen majority of this on, other lists or other people that are great when it comes to brand association and integrated marketing talking about this. And, that's amazing. I'm certainly not trying to reinvent the wheel, but again, it comes to the creative context in which it's applied. So what I want to do is spend a few minutes running through. I won't name the artist specifically because I don't know how far along they are in the process. I will get clearance from that artist because, he is an amazing artist. I become very good friends with, both him and his manager, who also happens to be his fiance, but she's a very great music industry executive. But I was talking with them in conversation, just offering some advice casually over dinner that they had asked for. And he said he has, a new album that he wants to put out, and contextually, he really wanted to have something unique about this artist. So we started talking more beyond his talent, beyond the actual music, about his brand. And I found out that, he's Creole. He's also a very, very passionate vegan, and he's a hip hop artist. So I came up with a concept, just on the fly, that we've actually explored since then, of instead of having the medium of a collection of songs come out on whether it's, digital or, physical on an LP or CD or whatever the case may be, let's take the intersection of this Creole family, background, but also his passion around, veganism, and put it into a cookbook. And just, he lit up so much when I said that, because he was talking about all these amazing recipes, and I'm very interested in trying, but looking at the scalability, again, how can we translate this from something very active to passive? So we looked at the concept of not only building a cookbook, but also looking at vegan or Creole restaurants, or even his own creations from a food standpoint, popping up at his events and having them catered. These are also third parties that we can engage with. His neighborhood here in New York has a lot of Creole influence, but there's also a lot of vegans in the area. So coordinating to have those third parties come, pay some sort of sponsorship engagement, rate that they are actually paying you to associate with your brand and your audience. We also discussed looking up local vegan and Creole shop to where he could make appearances, having an actual listening party instead of at a venue or at some sort of a hall that he rents out, actually doing it in one of those stores. There's absolutely a way to monetize that. But then we really started getting creative with it, taking these recipes potentially to restaurants and having him, instead of doing a music residency, looking at actually having him do like a cooking or chef residency, and also having these entities incorporate custom menu options. So a lot of this is still very service-based. There are ways to derive this into that passive structure, and that's when you get into looking at third parties, whether that's him starting to bottle his own ingredients, or looking at third-party ingredient manufacturers, sponsorship, endorsement, or licensing scenarios to where he can have his personal brand and his talent affixed to that. Looking at other third-party, vegans or Creoles that are looking to produce recipes that intersect with him, his personal brand and his audience, starting to review that. That's an entire separate alternative revenue stream on, YouTube or whatever video app you want to use. This also gives him a mechanism to start raising awareness for these entities, fundraisers. There is a lot of money when it comes to nonprofits that artists and personal brands can leverage. You also can obviously donate your time and your likeness, but it's a great way to start to build a community and then to extend from a passive standpoint, not only a return to him and his personal brand, but also to the community in general. And then third-party content marketing and lead generation is huge here. How many Creole vegans are there in New York, or shops that have that intersection? This is a way for him to, again, leverage his personal brand and have something that impacts third parties that, again, he can generate revenue. So what it comes down to is your creativity and your personal branded content. Those are your key differentiators. So again, the column on the left here are some very general examples, but the proof is in the pudding when you actually apply your personal brand. You can get really creative. So I mean, this was a 2-hour conversation over dinner that now is being broadcast to everyone here on this webinar. That's just one instance. So get creative, really understand your personal brand and your audience, and get creative. So the process here, just to wrap, is looking at your personal brand and your legacy development. Again, your personal brand is what you represent. Your legacy is the impact of that brand. Really understanding from the intelligence standpoint who your audience is, those basic consumption habits around them, researching the opportunity, what companies actually align in addition to that Venn diagram of your brand, your audience, and your influence. If you add a fourth component to that Venn diagram, what are the natural companies? Are they large corporations? Are they smaller startups that are willing to be much more flexible, that are interested in micro influencers? Look at the creative context for company engagement. That slide that we just had with all those very unique scenarios on the right column compared to the very generalized contextual examples on the left. Once you know what companies you potentially can engage with, that's a scenario where you can start to draw up those very interesting scenarios on how to actually apply that. And then in the short term, some easy targets are those sponsorship, licensing, and endorsement scenarios. And the long term, that could open up to equity-based, positions with the companies you're actually investing. The return on the investment of time here is to be able to really build value in your personal brand, build a deeper connection with your audience, and also to generate passive, especially passive income from third-party companies. And then finally, just the wrap here is the sustainable perspective is just that. Now you have a more empowered brand that you can leverage. You have more passive income that you're seeing from these relationships. And in general, you can have a larger impact that plays absolutely into that legacy component. So I want to be respectful of time. I'm sure there's some questions that have come in. That's me, Brian Penick, managing partner of Legacy Entertainment Ventures. You'll see a hashtag that we float around on social media a lot, which is what is your legacy? And it's really starting that contextual questioning of, who are you? What is your brand? What does it represent? And then following through, everything, your audience, and really what you want that sustainable perspective to be. So with that being said, I'll open it up to any questions. I know we're a little tight on time, but yeah, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully this at least has the mental gears turning.
Thank you so much, Brian, for your informative presentation. And as he said, if you have any questions, please do submit it through the questions box on your GoToWebinar platform. And I'd like to also thank everyone today for attending. It's great having you, and great getting to share the information with you. Looks like we just got a question popping in now.
Yeah. Do you mind handling the questions and throwing them my way?
Sure. So first question is, can you give an example of a fee or fee range that you've seen for a campaign in the startup/small business side?
I mean, it's absolutely on a case-by-case scenario. It depends on if you're pushing like a service, or a product or service are the two categories that it typically would fall into. If it's a one-time scenario and you're looking for the startup to just be at an event, and it's say you have an event, 500 cap room booked, sold out, and you are looking to have a startup come in, sponsor that event. Maybe it's something that pertains very specifically to music. Maybe it's like a piece of wearable technology or something like that. You can ask the company what's known is their customer acquisition cost. So what's their current cost to acquire new customers, and price it out. They'll probably say a few cents up to a few dollars, and then you can do that on a per head basis. If it's less tangible, not actually at an event, and it's a single sponsored post, Don't be afraid to throw out the first number, because the negotiation, unless they just, slam the phone down, or I don't even know how many of you are actually talking on landlines. Don't be afraid to, go big or go home. And that specific scenario, I think, a customer acquisition cost of maybe $2 per head. I think a startup would see immense value in that. And if you've got 500 people at the event and it's literally just a one-off scenario, that's $1,000 right there. When it comes to, any expenses for marketability, promoting that brand alongside, like on the banner advertisements, on the marquee, things like that, you could factor that in. But I mean, how many smaller artists out there that can draw, even less than 500 in their hometown, that are working with a startup that's either in their hometown or looking to scale into their hometown, wouldn't take an extra $1 or $2 per head. So again, it's case by case. If you start to throw out, crazy numbers, then people might respond and think that you are crazy. But you can certainly try. I mean, we've thrown out some large numbers with past clients and gotten away with it. And we were giggling internally, and the relationship did, provide positive ROI for the company. But at the end of the day, we started to really look, and this is obviously why I've derived Legacy Entertainment Ventures, and that although it was a good single payout for the company, I'm sorry, for the artist, the personal brand, and their talent, at the end of the day, the company saw a much larger windfall of that, impact from the engagement. So I know that's very little context. It's not getting into. There are some people who have started to quantify the value of individual sponsored posts. There's a lot of great references out there, so I would just get to Googling and see what's out there, and then test the waters. The worst case scenario, somebody's going to come back with a lower number.
Thank you, Brian. We got another question popping in. Can you share any resources available for understanding your or similar artist fan bases? Examples being insight dashboards, public-facing social media analytics, etc.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding this question. When it comes to understanding your fans, are you talking more specifically about like the objective/subjective research on that slide? Let me go back to it. The characteristics, the audience intelligence, because if so, I mean, you could do some basic demographic research, for DMAs when it comes to marketing, well beyond just music. But a lot of this is really just paying attention to your audience. Once you understand some of the basics and a little bit of the advanced, actually spend some time on your fans' social profiles, see what they're posting about. We do have some templates where you can view this for at least other artists with regard to musicians' desk reference. But when it comes to that, very regimented process of understanding your fans, I would look more into typical demographics from a marketing perspective, not so much from a music perspective. There's a lot of great resources out there, and I don't necessarily want to name. I want to encourage you to go click around it and read multiple resources. But at the end of the day, again, from a marketing, advertising, and agency perspective, a lot of this content exists, but contextually it hasn't necessarily been developed into the music industry. And once you do gain this intel, this is something that's it's deeply personal to you and your audience. So things might match up compared to, marketability structures for, third parties outside of music. Things might be completely unique to you and your audience. So hopefully that answers your question. But it's really about, you have to go to the battleground of social media, if you will, and you really have to look through your fans. This is something that once you start to gain intel, maybe it's something if you're a pop artist in, or a country artist in Nashville or wherever, maybe you can get some artists who are, similar genre, similar size, to divide and conquer that work, and then you can have some, group intel and then market against that. So hopefully that is at least some context that's helpful. Well, and just for reference, when I do this with corporations, we do it completely from scratch. We have some basic context from, again, that agency advertising model, but we start this absolutely from scratch.
All right, we're just over time, but if anybody has any last minute questions, take about another minute. As I said, thank you again, Brian, for today's presentation, and thank you for everybody for tuning in to the Common Ground webinar series.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hopefully this was helpful, and best of luck to you all in your journey, in your career.
All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day and week.
Thank you very much.